did you get in? Because I think you and Mounira were having the same problems. Did you go?
I went to the web page. I think it's this link right here. I put in the chat box. I went to that link and then I put the password in. I just cut and pasted it.
Okay, let me see if she can do that and then we'll get started. I apologize for the technical difficulties. We're going to get started in just a moment. We're trying to get our last panelist in the room. I just do a quick temperature check. I see Eboni here. I see Cherese here. Elizabeth, I saw you earlier. You here? I just want to make sure all the other panelists are good. Yep. Okay. And I know people are still entering. While people are entering, I want to invite you in the chat to share your name, your pronouns, and any information, institutions that you are coming from. So your name, pronouns, institutions, positions that you hold, please feel free to use the chat so we know who's in the room today. We have now, I'm seeing over 88 participants and they're still coming in. And I welcome you, and we will get started in just a minute once we can get our last panelist in the room. And I will even share my screen just to give you a picture. Disclaimer, the folks in this picture, this was pre-COVID. So I got a lot of comments the other day when I shared this picture. They thought we were all kind of gathered around a table without masks and concerned. Let me just say that this is a picture from our past programming through the Office of Multicultural Affairs. And I'll give you that to look at as we get this last panelist in here. Okay, Mounira, are you in the room? If not, I'll just get started here just for the interest of time, because I know it's now 11 past. I'll give it one more second to see if she gets in. Mounira, are you here? All right, well, while we wait, I do want to welcome you all. Again, I invite you all to share your names, pronouns, positions, titles, institutions, where you're zooming in from. Again, my name is Felicia Lundquist. I serve as the Director of Multicultural Affairs here at Springfield College. I go by she, her, hers pronouns. And we're gonna start off this session doing a land acknowledgement. I apologize in advance. I know that some folks have different land acknowledgements or wording. This is the one that I have here that I'm going to use. I just want to share the importance of this. So many of our community members are Indigenous and Native folks, have been invisible and have not had and have been exposed to violence. And it is important to acknowledge the land that which we stand and occupy as a first practice. And so in that, I just want to acknowledge with this land acknowledgement here is that we acknowledge the land on which we stand or occupy today as Algonquin inhabitants of Agawam. And I'm speaking specifically for sort of Springfield College as it sits there, but you can see on the bottom, there's a website that if you're not particularly in this area, you can find out from the website what areas, what Native Indigenous folks inhabited that particular area. And so we want to acknowledge that Agawam or Akawam and also Nonotuck land or the original homelands to the traditional home of our neighboring Indigenous nations, the Mashpee Wampanoag, Aquinnah, Wampanoag, Puckumtuck, Norowak, Nipmuc, and Mohican, Pequot, Narragansett tribes, and any other Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New England tribal nations. The indigenous place that we're located roughly translates to low-lying marshlands, and also thinking about sort of our location, it's now called the Connecticut River, from the present day of Enfield, Connecticut, and the Holyoke Range. Without them, we would not have access to this gathering, to this panel discussion, and this dialogue. So we take this opportunity to thank the original caretakers of the land and encourage you to learn more about these tribes today and move forward on how to best support our Native Indigenous peoples. And again, for your ease, you can check out this and I'll put it in the chat. Is Mounira in the room? Oh, all right. All right. I am not sure what happened here, but we're going to get started. First and foremost, I want to acknowledge our panelists. And so first and foremost, we have one panelist missing, but I'm hoping that we'll get them in. This session today is an opportunity for us to talk about the experiences of Black and Indigenous Brown people, women in particular, and the invisibility and slow pace of upward mobility for BIPOC and women of color in higher education. The panel seeks to explore the experiences of BIPOC and women of color in higher ed and the challenges that they face while also breaking through obstacles of oppression, acquiring alternative knowledge, and counter the discourse that women of color are solely tokens, systematically marginalized, and victims of marginalization in the academy. During this panel, we will have access to women of color that will examine and leverage, that have examined and leveraged their own personal and professional positions to challenge the status quo in their leadership and service and scholarship and activism to leadership. So first and foremost, I want to acknowledge that one of our panelists, Dr. Mounira Morris, is not in the room just yet, and we're gonna work on that in just a minute. But Dr. Morris, she has taught in the Masters of Education program over at Northeastern. She advises doctorate in education students, and she will be hopefully entering soon. Next, I want to acknowledge our next panelist, Cherese Childers-McKee. Dr. McKee completed her PhD in educational studies with a concentration in cultural studies at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. Her research interests include language and identity, community engagement research, urban schools, critical literacy, teacher leadership, social justice education, and intercurricular relations. She also holds a graduate certificate in women's and gender studies. Next, we have Eboni Rafus-Brenning. I hope I said it right. She is serving as the new director of the Amherst College Multicultural Research Center. And I had the pleasure of being at UMass with Eboni. And after 7 years in Los Angeles, she's come back to this area. And so we're grateful to have her. And she's spent the last 4.5 years working at Viewpoint School in K-12 independent schools in California as an upper school coordinator for diversity and inclusion, where she advised students, clubs, and organizations. Eboni, I'm gonna give each person a chance to also talk a little bit more. Our last panelist is Elizabeth Cardona, who also is a colleague I get to work with over at BAPATH, and she identifies as a proud Boricua or Puerto Rican woman, championing progress grassroots movements with over 25 years of experience in community engagement, mentoring, and leadership development and expertise. She currently serves as the Executive Director for Multicultural Affairs, International Student Life at BAPATH University. So without further ado, I want to welcome and thank all of our panelists for being here today. I will serve as the moderator for this panel discussion. And I want to just turn it over, and I'm going to just, based on my screen here, give our panelists a minute to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about themselves, because I know that my introduction and reading of bio really just is just a snippet of who they are. So in my window, I have Eboni first. Eboni, would you like to introduce yourself and share a few things?
Hey everyone, my name is Eboni Rafus-Brenning. My pronouns that I use are she, her, hers. I'm so happy to be here. My route to my current career has been a little circuitous. I started off as and still consider myself as an artist. Went to film school at NYU, worked in film and television in Los Angeles, on different game shows, on the show Dawson's Creek, and then decided to come back to school to earn my MFA in creative writing. That's how I was able to meet Felicia at UMass. I really struggled in my MFA program, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but because it took me longer to finish the MFA, it was a 3-year program and it took me about 4 years. I had extra courses. And so at that point I was halfway through an MA. So I said, I might as well get an MA in literature as well. And so then I did 2 master's programs back to back. In hindsight, I probably should have just gone for the PhD because I was in grad school for 7 years total, and wrote a book length dissertation, with thesis. But you know, I could have been just writing a dissertation and getting a PhD, but you know, hindsight's 2020. And so I spent 7 years in academia before returning to teaching, and now serve as the director of the Multicultural Resource Center at Amherst College. So I've had a couple of different careers and kind of came to my current position in a kind of, you know, non-traditional way. So I'm happy to talk about, you know, how you can have starts and stops and detours and still eventually get to where you want to be.
Thank you, Eboni. And I just learned that Dr. Morris is in the room. She has her phone at this point. So I'm happy that we have all of our panelists. Woo-hoo-hoo. Next in my window, I have Dr. Cherese Childers-McKee. Can you take a moment to introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. Felicia, can you hear me okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. I'm Cherese. I am from Charlotte, North Carolina native. Still live here in Charlotte, work through the Northeastern University Charlotte campus. I started as a career teacher. I was a K-12 teacher for a long time, English as a second language. I thought that I would stay as a teacher. That was just the career that I had chosen. I was gonna do that forever. I loved it. Went to a conference at UNC, was introduced to kind of academic world and just saw something different and decided to try it. And so my life is very different now, but I always have to give a shout out to my teacher days because that still, you know, really shapes who I am as an instructor and as a curriculum developer now. I work at Northeastern. I work with education doctorate students. Our students are engaged in action research. So I'm really, really committed to kind of community engagement, community engaged research and social justice related topics, etc. I went through graduate school with 3 kids. And so definitely had those messages of why are you here and you don't belong here. And so for anybody who is in that space, definitely standing here as a person to say that, you know, it's possible and that you can do it, you can keep pushing. So happy to be here with you today.
Thank you, Cherese. Dr. Morris, can you introduce yourselves, give us a little background? Dr. Morris, are you with us? All right, we're going, I'll move over to, because I do see Elizabeth Cardona. Elizabeth, can you do that? And I'm gonna just text to see if I can get this together here.
Hi, hello everyone. I'm so excited to be here with all of you this morning and sharing a little bit about myself and my experience. I'm a proud alumna of Springfield College, and I will say proudly that it was at Springfield College that I was able to really understand who I was and the work that I was doing. I don't know if Professor Delano Davis is in the space, but she was my advisor. We're still close. And I was doing community organizing, and she connected me with Arise for Social Justice. And I learned what I was doing in my community was important and valuable. I leveraged my peers at Springfield College to do a lot of community organizing. And that work really kind of spearheaded everything that I've done and continue to do. And what I mean is at Springfield College, I was able to connect with the Multicultural Affairs Office. And even though, you know, Cherese, I had 2 kids when I was at Springfield College as a non-trad. So I'd be in the class, and sometimes my older son was in the back taking notes. But, as growing up in Springfield in the North End, one of the most poorest community, never saw myself going to college. And so as I was at Springfield College, I was completely mesmerized that it was possible for someone like me to be in college. And I think in my role following, Springfield College, I've been in roles in education and also in government, and now back in higher education. And I think what keeps me grounded is my commitment to community and my experiences as a student that, I see myself in many of our students, but also the impact and the transformation that can happen when we collaborate and we are able to put ourselves out there and support not just what happens on campus, but also in the community. Felicia, we can't hear you.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Thank you, Elizabeth. So we have Dr. Mounira Morris also. I think I unmuted her. Dr. Morris, can you share a little bit about yourself?
Good morning. Can you hear me?
We can. Thank you so much for being here.
Yes, yes. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mounira Morris, and I am currently a faculty member for the graduate school education at Northeastern University. So Cherese is definitely my colleague. I'm from Boston originally, and I'm also first gen. And so I pursued a degree in business because my mother said that's where the money is, right? So I never thought of education as a career path. I thought individuals who work in student affairs, resident life, Greek affairs, are people who just never wanted to grow up. And so I never thought there was actually a career path for me until I met my advisor of my master's program in higher ed. And so fast forward, all of my higher ed experience, student affairs experience, has been in diversity affairs, diversity, equity, inclusion work, mainly at small liberal arts institutions. And Northeastern recruited me to serve as an adjunct, and now I'm full-time. And so a lot of my work is on scholarships. It focuses on underrepresented students, particularly at small institutions. And like Cherese, I advise doctoral students, but also teach in our master's in higher ed program. And I'm just happy to be here. So thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Dr. Morris. I also just have to add a plug. Dr. Morris is also my sorority sister. We belong to the illustrious organization of Sigma Gamma Rho Sorority Incorporated. Yep. And I'll just leave it at that. So let's just dive right in to, I have to put a plug. Our questions. So navigating the academic terrain as a woman of color can be exhausting and both uphill. Can you, and this is to any of the panelists that choose to answer, can you talk about what have been some of the challenges or the obstacles or barriers that you have had to come across and or overcome?
I'm happy to start. As I briefly mentioned in my introduction, earning actually both my MFA and my MA was definitely not without struggles. I was single and didn't have any children at the time, so I didn't have to have that extra responsibility. But I really struggled with how do I word this? I really struggled with being patronized and talked down to. I really struggled with administrators of my program feeling like they had to explain things to me that I obviously couldn't have and didn't understand. And at the same time, I was always asked to explain myself and my culture and my ways of knowing and ways of being. So 2 quick stories to illustrate what I mean is that it took me 4 years to do a 3-year degree because the degree requirements for my program was not very transparent. It said one thing on the website and one thing in the materials that was presented to us, but actually worked in a complete different way that wasn't necessarily transparent. It was, you just had to know the right people to know the ins and outs of how to navigate the program. It wasn't something that was like explicit. And when I challenged that, I was basically told that that I didn't understand. So to give you an example, we had a requirement where in my MFA program, I was a fiction writer. They asked us to take 3 courses in literature that were modern or contemporary literature, 9 credits total. So I did that. I took African-American literature, I took modern Irish literature, I took literature of the Harlem Renaissance. But then when I went to present my credentials for my degree, they said, oh, yes, but you're a fiction writer, so you need to do 2 classes in fiction and 1 class in poetry. That's specifically poetry and poetry only. When I explained that that wasn't anywhere in any of the written documentation, nothing on the website, nothing in the degree requirements, it was, and I said this wasn't transparent, what I actually got was an explanation on what the word transparent meant. My advisor at the time was like, oh, well, transparent comes from the business world, and that's not the word you really want to be using. The word that you're really thinking about is, you know, this other word. And I had to stop and say, no, I mean transparent, as in clear, as in you can see through it, as in it is obvious to anyone who's reading this document what it means. And, you know, in that moment when I was meeting with this person who was the director of the program, I really felt like, I started to, you know, I was basically being gaslit. I started wondering about my own like understanding, and am I, you know, am I crazy here? Is this reality the same? And if it weren't for another student of color who was outside the room, who could hear the conversation going on inside the room, I talked to that student later, a good friend of mine, and she confirmed my experience. That was really what made me realize, you know, that my experience was how I was understanding my experience was true. So, you know, they asked me to take more courses, which I did. So I took a class on African-American poetry because they wanted me to take a class specifically on poetry. As it's written in all of the, you know, materials and website, it was supposed to be modern and contemporary poetry. And I took African-American poetry that started at slave narratives on to the Harlem Renaissance. And even though 2/3 of the class was not modern nor contemporary, they still accepted it. And so what I struggled with basically was a shifting of goalposts. Like they say one thing and then you meet that and they say, no, we meant this other thing, right? And so that was a struggle. And making me feel like I was just misunderstanding what they wanted, when really what they wanted was shifting. And then another quick example is I was writing a novel in my MFA program, and the main characters were all African-American, and many of them from the American South. And there were a lot of different colloquialisms and cultural understandings that were embedded into my narrative that I did not explain. I didn't stop, you know, the narrative to explain that kitchens meant the tiny hairs at the back of your neck. I didn't stop to explain what certain foods were. And I was often asked to in writing workshops to say, we're confused about this. You know, you need to like write into your novel what these these words mean, or what this, you know, cultural understanding, you know, explain it for the white folk, basically. Like, and I absolutely refused. And I said, you know, either the readers will figure it out by context, or they can look it up. They can Google it. But I, you know, and I also explained that, you know, there were a lot of cultural understandings that weren't necessarily known to me about white culture and dominant culture. And it was my job as a person of color to always figure it out on my own, right? And that's what we do as people of color, particularly women of color, is we learn to figure it out on our own so that we can, you know, be in both spaces and be successful in both spaces. And so I challenged them to do the same. But that was, you know, another struggle, is that I was always asked to kind of teach as I wrote. So I'll sum it up by saying that I think the two things that I really struggled with was, one, being talked down to when people explaining things to me that I already knew, that I knew, and they were challenging my understanding, and also being asked to explain.
Thank you, Eboni. I really appreciate that. Would any of our other panelists like to answer that question of what have been some of the obstacles or barriers that you've had to overcome? And I just think about, as Eboni kind of shared, the idea of tokenism and having to do that work as a person as a woman of color, instead of your male counterparts or your white counterparts having to do that work. And so that's a term also, just thinking about sort of the invisible labor. Does anyone else on the panel want to dive in? Elizabeth, I see you.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'll just say myself, struggle is the many sort of roles that we have to play in different scenarios. And I think, you know, while it's a benefit sometimes to be in that space, right? Because we bring certain expertise and, you know, we want to make an impact. It is also, you know, a challenge because we want to succeed in those roles. And sometimes we don't have the resources nor the affirmation, right? From, you know, the power to be, to recognize what we bring. And it's interesting because when we are, we're hired for these positions, we're bringing, you know, our ethnicity, our race, our experiences, and they're valid, right? But then when it's time to be at the table and to be heard, seen, sometimes it's a struggle. And I think what I have found, you know, is that I have to, you know, really be intentional and strategic in what I do, and also being mindful that I am one person and I can only do so much. What I have learned is collaboration, finding allies, because sometimes I can say the same thing, but if a person who's not of color, a white person says it, it's like, oh my God, wow, I wasn't thinking like that. It's like, I just said that. So being very, you know, strategic, and it puts a lot on me personally. I know it puts a lot on, you know, my colleagues of color, because not only are we, you know, doing our work, but now we have to figure out how to do our work, right? So it puts an added burden at times. What keeps me, I think, motivated is our students. And I rely a lot on my students, on, you know, our work study, our graduate assistants. And, you know, sometimes I feel like I see myself and I don't want to give the wrong impression, but it is our reality, right? This is how we are able to navigate our roles. So, yeah.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Dr. Morris or Cherese, Mounira gave me permission to call her Mounira, but I do also want to acknowledge that just in my experience too, it's really important in terms of credentials, and I think women of color are often overlooked too, that have earned their degrees or have worked hard, which speaks to also sort of the microaggressions and invisibility of women. But for today's session, I've been given permission, want to acknowledge the credentials of our sisters in this room and on this panel as well. So Cherese or Mounira, do you want to tackle that, or we can move on to the next question?
Sure, I don't mind
Yeah.
jumping.
Go ahead, Cherese. So I was going to tell you this quick story. Thank you for sharing your experiences. So just quickly, I used to serve as Associate Dean of Students at Clark University in Worcester, Mass. And this was years ago. And I remember in my role, I needed data. I needed data on the persistent retention of students of color. So I spoke with one of my colleagues who's trying to obtain this data. And my colleague responded with, "Are you also looking for data on normal students?" Now, so I chuckle internally and I say, okay, do I come off as an angry Black woman, or do I just try to have a professional conversation with my colleague on the word normal, right? Because for me, the message is saying that my students of color are not normal, right? So for me, how I was able to overcome that is sitting down with my colleague, bringing up the book, while all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria, because Tatum has a chapter on that. And so you know, I asked him to read that chapter, and we had a conversation afterward. And you know, he apologized, obviously, but for me, it's more than the apology. Is I want to make sure that your perspective, your viewpoint does not affect the work working with students of color, and also our other colleagues at Clark as well. So for me, it's really trying to breathe and then think, well, what's the best approach? Because in this case, I needed to educate my colleague of how normal, the word normal itself is you know, can again have impact on our students and the way he thinks. So I just want to share that story very quickly when I heard our colleagues share their experiences.
Thank you, Mounira.
Hey, just to jump in real quickly, I just wanted to mention another obstacle or barrier that I think, you know, while we are dealing with the microaggression, the racism, patriarchy, all those things, I think that we also kind of have this, like, you know, battle that's going on in our mind and our spirit, and just wanted to mention that kind of the psychic damage, I think, that's done of, you know, a lifetime of dealing with these things. And I think many of us, you know, we come from a hard work ethic, and we just grind and work. And it's often, I found for me personally, I got to the age where, you know, I'm just weary at this point, and kind of, you know, processing that weariness, processing the struggles that we've had through a lifetime of kind of working against, you know, systems of oppression. And I think that that's another kind of internal battle or struggle that we're always facing. And I think, you know, also I talk to my students about kind of the imposter syndrome, and, you know, I recognize that in them, and I've struggled with that myself, that, you know, many of us, we've achieved our entire lives, we've achieved many things, but it's always, you know, that voice that's saying that you're not supposed to be here, or, you know, you're not good enough to do this or go to the next level. And so that's that kind of internal struggle that I want to make sure to mention, that, you know, many of us are always fighting, having to speak back to that negative voice that might be telling us that we don't deserve that seat at the table, and reassuring us ourselves that we indeed do.
Thank you, Cherese. Dr. Morris mentioned sort of this idea of the angry Black woman, and I heard the term microaggressions too, and I know many of us in this room understand that, but I just want to, just as someone, you know, doing this work, to give credit to Chester Pierce, who coined the term in the 70s and was an African-American faculty member back in the 70s at Harvard. And so when we think about, these microaggressions, and thinking about racism in particular, but also sexism, is it possible to speak up against racism without being caricatured as the angry Black woman that Mounira had mentioned? And do folks want to kind of talk about, dive a little bit into that, and the stereotype of that, and how do we overcome or deal or work with and navigate that?
I would say that my answer is two-part. Yes, There are ways to, as Mounira did, educate our colleagues, educate students without being seen as the angry Black woman. And also, I think that you get to a point in your life and in your career where you stop worrying about that. I mean, I can only speak for myself, but at this point, I'm not going to let the fear of being labeled the angry Black woman to stop me from speaking up or stop me from, fighting back or getting what I deserve. And so, two quick stories is one is that I think that one way to speak up without being labeled as an angry Black woman is to come from a place of acknowledging other people's intentions, but also acknowledging that intention and impact are two different things. And I understand that you didn't mean to offend. I understand that you came with positive intentions and that you just wanted to help. And and I know that you're a good person, and I'm not saying you're an awful, racist, horrible person. And what you said was very problematic for these reasons. I understand that you're a good person, and some of the things that you say or do can be really harmful. And so I think coming from, always acknowledging their good intentions is really helpful. And coming from, I also taught middle school and high school for many years. So always coming from a place of just wanting to educate, I think is very helpful. And the second thing I would say is, though, at a certain point, I personally feel like we have to stop letting that fear of being thought of as angry stop us, because I feel like that is white supremacy culture at work trying to keep us down by saying, well, you don't want to be seen as angry, or you don't want. I feel like we have a reason to be angry. A lot of, we have, centuries of racism and sexism and evidence and experiences that gives us good cause to be angry. So a quick story is that I was working at a school in Calabasas, California. I was an English teacher, and I found out kind of by accident that I was the lowest paid person in my department, even though I had comparable experience and comparable education. And one of my colleagues started at the school at $10,000 more than I did, our starting salary. And so I basically went around to everybody in my department and said, I know that this is something that we're taught in our society not to talk about. We're not supposed to talk about money. It's impolite. You're not supposed to ask these questions, but I'm asking these questions. If you feel comfortable, can you tell me like what your starting salary was when you started here and what you're making now? And I told them why. I said, I feel like I'm being underpaid, and I want to go to the head of school and advocate for myself, but I need to have the information to do that. Knowledge is power. And they all, were honest with me about what they were making. And so then I did some research about what someone with my education and my experience would be making and what everybody else in my department was making. And I went to the head of school and I basically said, you're underpaying me. This is what I should be making. This is what my colleagues are making. And I named it. I said, I'm the only Black teacher in the entire upper school. And I am the only person of color in our department. And I'm also being paid the least. So I'm not saying that your intentions were to be, racist or sexist, but I am saying that is the impact that's having on me. And I want $15,000 more for the next academic year. And 24 hours later, I received a new contract with $15 more as my salary. And so, if I had let that fear of being the angry Black person or the aggressive Black person stop me, I would have continued to be underpaid and, frankly, overworked, because I also named some of the invisible labor that I was doing. Like every single time they hired a Black person at the K-12 school, they asked me to meet with them and talk with them. And, so I was doing some like informal mentoring as well. So, I'll wrap it up by just saying that, yes, there are ways to get around that, but I also feel like that label can be used against us as a way to keep us down and keep us from speaking up. And I think that I personally do, and I would encourage other people to resist that, to resist worrying about that label. and do what you got to do.
Thank you, Eboni. I know that we're getting some questions from the audience as well. Does anyone else on the panel want to answer that question? Then we'll open up for, and Kate and Taylor are going to help me with questions. So if you do have questions, please use the chat function too. And does Mounira, Cherese, or Elizabeth want to tackle that question, or we can move on?
I just want to say that, you know, the angry Black woman can also be seen in multiple ways, right? So what I mean is, you know, like Latinas are, you know, categorized as being passionate, you know, Asian women, their silence is taken in different ways, or, you know, there's so many ways that people are looked at. And I want to thank Eboni for sharing her story, because we have to really look within us and see the value that we bring, and we can only advocate, right? And I think I said earlier about, you know, being, you know, the work that our students, you know, do and trying to validate them. Well, they're looking at us. The students that we are mentoring are looking at us. And if we don't stand up, if we don't, you know, show them, you know, if we're not going to do it for ourselves, because sometimes we don't tend to do things for ourselves, but let's do it for our students so that they can see that we are making a difference, and that they can also follow our lead as well.
Thank you, Elizabeth. You know, you mentioned something that I think is really important that I had in my notes here that I wanted to talk about, is validation. And I want to just make note and highlight and spotlight another woman of color in the field, Laura Rendon, who's a Chicana woman who I had to do research with as an undergrad, a graduate student who has coined the validation theory. And she talks about the importance of validating our communities and our students, and in particular our students of color, right? And so I think that that's a big piece. And you also spoke to mentorship. So those are two very important things, I think, as we navigate these terrains and the conversations, that it is really important to affirm and validate individuals, not just our students, but also the women, in this case, right, of color that are working, and the work that they're doing and the contributions that they give to these institutions, whether or not it's in and outside of a classroom. So thank you for mentioning that. I know, Kate, we had some questions, and then also Dr. Morris, Mounira, or Cherese, do you want to add? And Kate, then I'll hand it over.
Just wanted to say something real quickly. I love the stories that both Elizabeth and Eboni shared. And it makes me think about another woman, Lisa Delpit, and she talked about the codes of power. And I think this event and these stories are so important, because I think often we don't know how to confront microaggression. Like, we don't know the language to use. We don't know that we can go and advocate for ourselves in this way. And so I think that's so valuable, Eboni's telling these stories, so that people know that, you know, I can go and advocate in this way, and this is the language that I can use to advocate for myself. And it makes me think about even more being first gen, thinking about navigating across kind of class boundaries that many of us came to higher ed. And it's a completely different environment. It's a different mode of communicating. And there's just a lack of language to know how to advocate for yourself. And so I think that's why we're going to talk about mentorship is so important, that we come together and say, look, this is what you need to go and say. This is how you need to deal with these situations.
I agree. And then the last thing I want to add, I just want to go to the question. It's so important not only have mentorship, but also, I call it like the board of directors, to have your group of colleagues, friends that you can go to and say, you know, this is what happened in my workplace. You know, what strategies do you recommend? How can I navigate this piece? And I think for me, working in this field, that has been so instrumental in regards to in this work. And so I think that's also critical too, but I definitely will go to the questions.
Kate, did you have a question queued?
Yeah, I do. And then I also received a second one, so we can do this first one. I have to scroll up a little bit. There's been a excitement in the chat. So thank you all for sharing yourselves and your stories with us today. I really appreciate you and your sharing your experience. The first question that came up in the chat is, How do you balance feeling emotions and wanting to express them while also not wanting to look or feel weak?
That's a really, go ahead.
Well, okay. So, I think it is important to, what was pointed out earlier, to have your board of directors, have your mentors and your sponsors or whoever it is that you turn to, have that conversation. For me, I've had situations where I've had to, kind of go through the scenarios, right? So if I'm going into a meeting, what is it that I need to say? Why am I saying it? And having the data to show it, right? But also knowing that there's going to be some resistance, right? So how do I, what is it that I'm going to do to remain, committed to what I'm doing? And then having, the either other folks who might be in the same room, having that strategy in place. It can be emotional and it can be draining. And I have had situations where I've had, a breakdown, but for a good cause. And this is who I am. And when I show up to a meeting, I'm showing up, with everything and with the folks that can't be in the room. So, I think that in the end, I've had, some opportunities where it's been successful. And then when it has not been successful, I've then had to re-strategize and figure it out. So, I think having a plan is important. Trying to be as confident as possible, but also, we take on so much. And of course, we're going to be emotional, at times because it hurts. But, understanding that we have, a role and we, have to kind of push through that, find time for self-care, which is so important. And having a team that is going to be with you, besides you, behind you, and, reimagining if possible. If things don't work out the first time, keep trying.
Thank you. Mounira?
I mean, I was going to say the same thing. When the murder of George Floyd occurred in the spring, I mean, it literally put me in a different place, right? First of all, we know that police brutality, racial justice has been happening for decades. This is not new, although it was, some of my colleagues in the field, but then it was an eye opener. So I had to also respect where they are in that place around racial justice. But really, I was called to engage in so many conversations on this work. And I had to say to some colleagues, I need to walk away for a few days, few weeks, because of self-care, because it was also affecting me. I also teach a class on race, on social justice. And so for me, that self-care is so important. But at the same time, I had to let my colleagues know that this is painful, that what happened to Breonna Taylor, what happened to Sean Bell, I mean, we could name all the names that were black and brown bodies that were murdered by police officers. Is hurtful. And so going to what Eboni was saying, I had to share my emotions with my colleagues. And at the same time, what needs to be done in our workplace, teaching our students, in the field of education. And so, but the self-care was important, because if I didn't walk away for a few days, it would have affected my mental health. And so that is critical. So again, the emotion, it's okay to show that emotion, because I did show that emotion, but at the same time, walking away and just taking care of yourself.
Thank you, Dr. Morris. I know we have about 2 minutes. I know some of our panelists have to leave right at noon. And I'm happy to stay, and I don't know if other folks want to stay, but I just want to acknowledge there's a sort of 2-minute warning. So And I think there's a couple more questions in the chat. Kate or Taylor, will you help me out to see if there are
Yeah.
other?
Another question that came up is, as a non-traditional student, for someone who's older and starting a career in the business world, what advice would you give to not become disillusioned moving forward to a postgraduate reality?
I did both my undergrad and graduate as a non-traditional student. And I think, you know, going into it, understanding that it's going to be a challenge, finding your network and support system within, you know, both at Springfield College and where I did my graduate work was critical. And, you know, again, that self-care is, you know, something that you have to balance. Try to connect yourself also. My advice now, you know, having finished my graduate work, is to connect with folks who are in the field that you want to, you know, you want to follow, and building that network in that way as well.
Are there any other questions or any other panelists that want to address that question?
Someone named Donald had raised their hand. Donald's iPad had raised their hand while we were discussing a couple questions ago. I don't know if he still has his question.
Donald, do you want to, you can either use the chat function or unmute yourself. Do you want to ask the question? Donald, are you there? All right, well, we maybe find Donald. I did have one, as the moderator, I have one last question in terms of self-care, and I think a good way to sort of end or wrap up is, what are some of the self-care practices that you engage in or would advise others to engage in as you continue to navigate this terrain and fight the good fight?
I can jump in with that one. I've been thinking a lot about self-care recently, especially during COVID. And I think I would say, if you are, you know, in my age group or older, probably you think that you already have an idea of things you like and things for self-care. I would say just be open-minded to things that you haven't considered. Recently, I purchased a bicycle and I started bike riding. I've never thought that that would be something that would provide the amount of stress relief and just joy that it does, just to get on my bike and like ride in the wind and sun. And so that's been an amazing, you know, I'm thankful for that. Reading a good book, having a good conversation with somebody, turning your phone off, your computer off, all those things. Learning something new. I think those of us, especially in academic spaces, like reading and learning can become like laborious. And so I think just reading some good fiction or learning about a new skill to cook something new, like whatever just brings you joy.
I would also say, I love Mounira's point about having to take a couple days off when the murder of George Floyd happened. And I think that that is something, especially as someone who works in multicultural affairs, I feel like I need to be there for my students. I need to be available, but you know, you can't pour from an empty cup. And so I think, you know, using your vacation days and taking days off and also setting boundaries a little bit. Like my boundary right now, I have a 22-month-old. From 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. is off limits, because that's when I make dinner. That's when we sit down to dinner together. We do our bath routine and books and, you know, sing songs and put them to bed. And that time is sacred. And so I try to be very available and flexible, especially now when I have some students on campus, some students remote, but those 3 hours are non-negotiable. And I think that setting boundaries like that can be really, really helpful.
Thank you so much.
I like what Eboni said, because I know I could do a better job setting boundaries. But for me, is definitely walking, trying something new. But I will be honest with you, I have created a space for some of my Black colleagues and I to share a virtual space. We haven't done it in a while, but in the past we have, where we met once a month just to exhale, just to breathe. Because many of us are the only one in our concentration or in our programs. And so it's like how students, students of color or LGBTQ students or other underrepresented marginalized students have these spaces on these campuses. I'd say something similar. And I think for me, it's been very helpful. So that's part of my self-care as well.
Thank you, Mounira. I know that we're 2 minutes past and some people have to go, and I know some people are willing to stay. I do have one question that I think is really important that I want to pose really quickly that came to me privately. They had asked me, I would just like to know what major takeaways would you like attendees to walk away with, specifically white folks and white students like myself. How can we better help? I think that's a great question in terms of allyship and accompliceship. And I would just say, also, we have to encourage people to do that work too when we think about white fragility. But does anyone want to tackle that? And then just if people are open to putting it in the chat versus privately, also there might be questions that we can answer through the chat.
I can jump in real quickly with that. Mounira knows this. I shared a story yesterday about a student I was working with that I felt like he was taking his research through a very deficit lens. We've been struggling through this for about a year, and my colleague, white male colleague, came in yesterday. I was nervous about the whole production. I didn't know which way it was going to go, and he was supportive. He aligned with what I was saying to the student. I think about what Bettina Love talks about being co-conspirators. I love that term, that I think that, we need help in this struggle. And so just to, support your Black colleagues. Listen, don't take up so much conversational space. Listen to what they're saying, really listen and hear what they're saying.
I couldn't agree with everything that Cherese said. And also I think educate yourself. I think for people of color, it's just exhausting to have to continuously educate yourself, educate others about the experiences of people of color. And so, come with some, some content. We're happy to answer some of the questions, but don't expect, all people of color to be the ones who are giving you so much information that is readily available.
Thank you. So I just want to thank I know we're 5 minutes over now, and I know Cherese and Mounira have another meeting. So I want to thank you all for taking the time to serve us, right? But you are serving us and giving us knowledge, and knowledge is constructed and sharing your experiences and being vulnerable and taking risks. One of the things that's so difficult about this conversation is the repercussions and the fear of what if I speak my authentic truth in my experience, what are the implications? What are the consequences? And I can speak personally from that. And I think it's really important that we have the platforms to speak about our authentic truth. So I want to thank each and every one of you for taking the time to be on this panel. And I want to thank all the participants for all your questions and listening and to being at this table with us. So thank you. I know some of you have to go. We'll hang back for a second or so. Please fill out the evaluations. And again, thank you. Check out the rest of our seat at the table sessions this week. We're going all the way strong till Sunday.
Thank you, Felicia, for this opportunity.
Thank you, Felicia.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Have
Have a good day.
Dr. Mo.
Thank you so much, everyone.
That's Calvin.
Thank you. Oh, hi, Dr. Hill.
Hey, there's my friend Elizabeth. Hey, Elizabeth.
Hello, so good to be here. I'm just beaming with pride. Springfield College, woo! Oh my goodness.
Alicia and Cherese and the committee have just knocked it out of the ballpark. So this has just been a phenomenal week.
I'm impressed. I'm very impressed.
And Eboni and Mounira and Cherese, I don't know if Cherese is still here. I am just so honored to be here with all of you. Eboni, so good to see you again. I know we had a brief conversation this summer, and we're gonna get Felicia. Did you hear that, Felicia? You gotta get us together again.
Yeah, I gotta get it through a seat at the table, but we have a lot of, and that's the whole point of this, right? Is doing some cross-campus, cross-community work around D&I work, and also sharing resources and educating and building awareness. So yes, let me get through this week. And then also, oh, I should have mentioned this too. Dr. Joy DeBrew will be doing a session. Eboni and I have been working to co-host between Amherst College and Springfield College to have the author of Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome come November 13th. I should have said that in the chat, but so Elizabeth, I'll share that. I think I might have shared it already with you, but if I haven't, I will. And I know that they have a flyer that'll come out. Actually, I think it's out, it came out.
And Dr. Hill, you owe me a virtual coffee, so I'm putting it out there.
Today's a great day, but it's a little chilly, so I'm having tea this afternoon.
All right. I'm just saying, before COVID, we were supposed to meet, and I haven't forgotten.
Right. That's right. Well, I got you.
Giving you a little bit of.
I don't think we've had a chance to meet, but we'll get together as well. So maybe Felicia can have us all at the table, and we could break bread together.
Sounds good. This has been the highlight of my week.
Oh, I'm so glad.
Yeah, this is so great.
And now,
I mean, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm not even on camera, but I felt the energy, and you know, hearing from Eboni, you, Elizabeth, and of course Cherese, it's just been so powerful. So I hope we can meet soon, even via Zoom, just to continue the conversation. But I do have to jump off to this anti-racist curriculum work with my colleagues. But again, Felicia, great job. Calvin, always a pleasure. Calvin, you owe me lunch from years ago.
I mean, I don't know if that can happen virtually, but
I know. But Calvin, you owe me lunch, and I'm gonna I gotta jump up. But colleagues, thank you so much. Have a great day. And
thank you.
Safe.
Stay blessed.
Elizabeth and
Take care, everyone.
Cherese, I'm going to be hitting you up because I'm thinking about going into. I've been wanting to get a PhD or EDD, and I've been thinking about how I can do that with a toddler. And we're trying for baby number 2. So I'm like, I'm so hearing that you did this with kids and Cherese did this with 3 kids. I'm like, maybe it's not impossible for me to do that. So
and
I will.
I'm going to speak to you too, because I should have done this a long time ago, but I could have completed my MFA, and it's a terminal degree, and I should have done it a long time ago. So I'm thinking of starting in January. So I would love to have a conversation with you about, what your experience was like.
To talk to you about that. Yeah.
Okay. Good.
Felicia,
Good.
make sure that you connect Eboni with Marisol out of our regional online continuing education. Marisol actually just finished her, I believe it's her EDD from Northeastern, and they have a nice hybrid online program. And she's herself is a working adult. She's a parent, so she was able to complete that program, and I actually served as her external reader, so definitely doable.
And Mounira and Cherese are both at Northeastern too, and Mounira's in that program. So yeah, and I'm also in the process too. I need to get this. I need these credentials because I need to teach, and I need to get paid.
Come and join the club, y'all. Water's fine over here. Jump right in.
All right. I've got to hop off,
Springfield
but
College at Northeastern.
love and stay well, okay?
Okay. Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.
Do I stop recording, David, or do you stop recording? How does this work here?
Oh yeah, we're still recording social hour.
I think he's done. Let's see. Maybe I can.
I think David has to because he started. I gave him permission to.
So if I exit the room, does that mean that it's gonna is something gonna happen? Maybe I'll make him the host. Do you want to change? No. What do you know? What Taylor? What am I supposed to do? I don't know what to do here because I don't.
If you end the meeting, then the recording for them will stop. I can actually.
Okay, I'll let you do.
I can stop him recording, and then when you end the meeting, that's that.
All right. Well, I think we're done, and I'm gonna try to zoom into.